Hello, students. Today, you guys will be learning about lesson 6.10, graphs and functions in standard and factored form. This is unit 6. Today is Wednesday, the 15th of April. And very important that we go over this. Today's learning targets. I can explain the meaning of intercepts on a graph of a quadratic function in terms of the situation it represents. And also, I know how the numbers in factored form of a quadratic expression relate to the intercepts of its graphs. And when they talk about intercepts, they're referring to both the x and the y intercepts. Okay, so those are basically, that's basically what you will be learning today. So to start off, the warm-up for today is, it says, here is a graph of an equation, y equals 8 minus 2x. They give you the graph here. And now you're supposed to answer, where do you see the 8 from the equation in the graph? But in other words, how I want you to answer this is, what is the 8 called in the equation and the graph? Go ahead and put your answer now. All right, cool. Now that you had an opportunity to write what 8 is called and where it's found. So 8 is called the y-intercept because that is where the line crosses the y-axis, and that basically is here. Okay, this is called your y-intercept because that is where your line crosses the y-axis. The second question, and where do you see it on the equation? On the equation, you see it right here. Question number 2, where do you see the -2 from the equation in the graph? So how I want you guys to answer this is, what is -2 called in this equation? Go ahead and answer that now. All right, thank you. Okay, so let's go over it. So -2 in this equation is called the slope. So this is -2. It represents the rise over run. But because in this situation, the slope is a negative, the line's going down. So instead of rising up 2 and running 1, we're going to go down 2 and then run 1. And this is where our first point is. And if you notice, these are going by 2's. So this would be technically 1, 2, and then this is 1 over. So we go down 2, 1 to the right, and that would be our -2. And finally, what is the x-intercept of the graph? Go ahead and write down what the x-intercept of this graph is. Okay, cool. So now that you had a chance to do that, the x-intercept, well, if this 8 is called the y-intercept, then therefore the x-intercept would be this 4 right there. So the x-intercept is this point, and we always write that point as a x comma 0. In terms of the y-intercept, we always write that as 0 comma the y-intercept. Okay. And how does it relate to the equation? It relates to the equation because if you were to plug in a 4, so in your equation you have y is equal to 8 minus 2x. If we were to plug in a 4 inside of our x, we would get y is equal to 8 minus 2 times 4 is 8, and 8 minus 8 is equal to 0, which is what this point right here is. Okay, so that is your warm-up. Let's go down to the first activity. So the first activity says, relating expressions and their graphs. Here are pairs of expressions in standard form. So this equation is in standard form, and factored form, and this equation is in factored form. Each pair of expressions define the same quadratic function, which can be represented in the given graph. So what they want you to do is they want you to identify the x-intercepts and the y-intercepts for each graph. Okay, so I'm going to give you an opportunity to do the first one on your own. So given these two equations in standard form and in factored form, and given this graph, which represents both of these, what would be the x-intercepts? What would be the y-intercepts? Go ahead and put your answer now. Okay, so now that you guys had a chance to do that, let's go over this. So in this situation, the x-intercepts are basically where the graph crosses the x-axis. So this is your x-axis, so that's why it's called the x-intercepts. So the x-intercepts would be that point there and that point there. And if I were to write these down, I would write these down as -3, 0, so -1, 2, 3, 0, and -1, 0. And what is the y-intercept? The y-intercept is where the graph crosses the y-axis. So it's crossing the y-axis right here. And what is that point? You will write that as 0, 3. Now, what they want you to do is they want you to see how these answers relate to a standard form and a factor form equation. So I want you to notice what our x-intercepts are on their graph and our two expressions here, and our y-intercept 0, 3, and how that relates to these two equations. So now that I went over this, you guys have to try this one on your own. So based off of these equations and these graphs, what are the x-intercepts? What are the y-intercepts? Go ahead and do that now. Okay, so now based off of the graph, we can tell that this is our first x-intercept and this is our second x-intercept. So that'll be 1, 0 and 4, 0. And our y-intercept would be this point right there, which would be 0, 4. Now, how do you relate those x-intercepts and y-intercepts to these equations? Well, I want you to notice your x values here and your x values there. All right. Now, if you do not understand, oh, and also your y-intercepts, I want you to notice this point, and I want you to notice where does that point correlate to this expression here. Okay, so look at these, look at your x-intercepts, look at this standard form, and look at your y-intercept. So go ahead and answer function H on your own. So what would be the x-intercepts and the y-intercepts by just looking at your standard form and your factor form? Go ahead and answer that now. Okay, so now that you guys had a chance to answer this question, let's go ahead and I'm not even going to worry about this graph because by now you should be able to see how these x-intercepts and these y-intercepts correspond to our standard form and factor form. So let's first talk about x-intercepts. Well, I told you in function g that these two factored forms relates to the x-intercepts. So how does this relate to our x-intercepts? Well, I noticed here that my first point was 1, 0, and here I have x minus 1. Here I have 4, 0, and here I have x minus 4. So, and our intercepts were 1, 0, and 4, 0. So following the same pattern, if I have this negative x minus 3 and this x plus 3, then my x-intercepts would be x minus 3 and I'm sorry, -3, 0 and 3, 0. Okay, so basically the way you figure out the x-intercepts with your factored form is you have to look at what would make this a 0. And what would make x minus 3 a 0 is if I were to plug in a 3. So 3 minus 3 would be 0. What would it make a x plus 3 a 0? If that would make it a 0 if I were to plug in a -3. So -3 plus 3 would be 0. Same thing over here. What would make x minus 1 a 0? What I would have to do is I would have to plug in 1 minus 1, and that would give me 0. Same thing with 4. 4 minus 4 would be 0. So in other words, you just basically change the sign of our x-intercept, of our factor forms to be able to find our x-intercepts. Now the y-intercept is a lot easier than that. We look at our standard form, and if you haven't noticed already, basically your very last value, which is called the C value, is your y-intercept. And we always label the y-intercept as a coordinate point of 0, -9, or 0, that y-intercept. In this case, 4 was our y-intercept. That's why it's 0, 4. Over here, 3 was our y-intercept. So that's why it was 0, 3. Okay, so those are a couple of examples. Here are some more examples for us to go over. Now I'm gonna do these 3 and you're gonna answer these 2 questions down here. So I'm not even gonna look at this graph. I'm based off of this. Well, I noticed that I don't have the last term. I don't have the third term. So for example, here I have x squared minus 5x plus 4. I have that plus 4. Here I have x squared plus 4x plus 3. I have this plus 3. In this question, in this problem, I don't have that extra term, so I'm going to add it as plus 0. That's going to help us find our y-intercept. Now, in this situation, I have x parentheses x minus 5. So my 2 x-intercepts would be this point and this point. So this x minus 5, I changed the sign, and my first coordinate point would be, okay, let's do this one first. So this x doesn't have a number inside of it like this, so that coordinate point would just be 0, 0. In this case, x minus 5, we change the sign of minus 5, and it'll be 5, 0. Here, our y-intercept, because it doesn't have the third term or the constant term, our y-intercept would be that term here, which is 0, 0. And similarly, in this case, we don't have the third term. So we don't have that third term that goes here. So my y-intercept would be 0, 0. But this one is a little bit tricky because here they switched the 5 minus x. Normally it would say x minus 5, but they switched it around. So the first coordinate or the first y-intercept would be this one here. Oops. Because this one is does not have the parentheses, we just basically label this as x plus 0. It's almost the exact same thing. So here our first point would be 0, 0. And then to be able to figure out this x-intercept, we kind of need to solve it. So in order for us to solve it, we say 5 minus x is equal to 0. We add x to both sides to isolate the x. This cancels out, and we're left with 5 is equal to 0 plus x is just x. So then our point would be 5, 0. And our y-intercept, we went over that over here in the beginning, so that'll just be 0, 0. And if you look at the graph, you can see that this graph crosses at x equals 0 and x equals 5. That's why we have 0, 0 and 5, 0. And then our y-intercept would be this point right here, which is 0, 0. And finally, in this situation, we notice that this factored form has the exact same terms here. So then our intercepts would, these signs would change to -2. So our x-intercepts would be -2, 0 and -2, 0, which is basically the same exact point, meaning that it only crosses the x-intercept one time. And if we go to our standard form equation, we look at the very last term, and that would give us our y-intercept, which is 0, 4. Okay, so now you guys are going to answer this question. It says, what do you notice about the x-intercepts and the y-intercepts and the numbers in the expressions defining its function? In other words, what do you notice about the numbers that make these expressions and the x and the y-intercepts? Go ahead and put your answer now. Okay, so now that you guys had a chance to write down what you noticed, here I have an example for you guys. So x squared plus 4x plus 3 is the same thing as x plus 3 and x plus 1. This is just written in standard form, and this is written in factored form. If we look at our factored form, we know that our intercepts, our x-intercepts will be -3, 0, and -1, 0, because we always switch the signs of our x-intercepts when they are in factor form. Our y, these are your x-intercepts, x-intercepts. To be able to find our y-intercepts, or our y-intercept, we look at our standard form at the very last term, the constant term here. So we write that as 0, 3. And if I were to graph this, my graph would be a point, an x-intercept at -3, 0, an x-intercept at -1, 0, a y-intercept at 0, 3, and then my graph going in the upward direction like this as a parabola. Okay, so now you're going to answer question number 3. It says here is an expression that models the function p, another quadratic function. So they give you the quadratic function in factored form. They want you to predict the x-intercept and the y-intercept. So kind of looking at this, what would be your x-intercept and your y-intercept? Go ahead and put your answer now. Okay, so now that you had an opportunity to do that, well, we know that from this point, we can find our x-intercepts by switching those signs. So our first x-intercept, since this says x minus 9, it's going to be 9, 0. And then since this says x minus 1, our other x-intercept would be 1, positive 1, 0. Now, that's how you find your x-intercepts. Now, to find your y-intercept, it's going to be a little bit trickier. What we have to do here is basically multiply these two terms like you guys have been practicing with multiplication in your previous lessons. So we're going to use the area method of multiplication. We're going to put x minus 9 here, and then x minus 1 here. So x times x is x squared. X times -1 is -1x. -9 times x, that's -9x. And -9 times -1, that's equal to +9. If I were to combine like terms, I would be left with x squared. The -1x and the -9x combine, and that becomes -10x. And we're left with the +9 at the end. And that +9 will be your y-intercept. And we will write that as 0, 9 for your y-intercept. Okay, so hopefully you guys understood that. The last thing that you guys are going to do is it says find the values of p and q. So you need to figure out what this equals and what this equals, okay, given this or in this equation represented by the graph. So look at this graph. You need to say p equals and what q equals. Go ahead and put that in now. Okay, cool. So now that you had an opportunity to try it, well, we know our x-intercept is that point and that point there. Okay, so this point is 1, 0, and that point is 3, 0. And we know that because this is a +3, whenever I have my answers in factor form, I need to change their sign. So in this case, p will be +1. And since this says x minus q, since this is minus, then when I switch the sign, it's going to be positive, which is this 3 here. So q would be +3. And those would be your answers. So basically, these numbers are the ones that go here and that go in there. All right. So now that we went over this and you guys had an opportunity to try it out, what you got to do now is go back to Schoology and do the code down. If you have any questions, please email your teachers. Thank you very much for being awesome and for doing the work. You guys rock. Hope you guys are all safe and good luck with your code down. With that being said, have a good day and get to work on the code down. Take care.